Hello and welcome to Manibil. I'm going to have a little a peek at another YouTube channel called THUNK, which I subscribe to and have done for a bit of time at this point. It's very sort of short little short little videos of like, in the 10-minute, range. And it's usually not deeply philosophical, but it sort of points to various questions or, traditionally hard to answer, philosophical aspect like Hume's or maybe, right? Or some psychology on various aspects of deeper thinking, you could say, that might poke me in certain directions, right? So I like these. I usually don't like short videos. I tend to be more focused on the long and, in-depth discussions, dissertations, you know, discourses. But I like this guy. He's very sort of to the point and has a bit of humor and right. So I would just like to take a stab at this one, which is called Dual Process Theory and the Mythical Number Two. And let's just head into it. That was a bit of Vivaldi, right? Probably the most cherished classical, well, let's post-romantic era, classical post, I mean, pre-classical era classical music, right? Baroque, maybe, right? Probably the most famous and cherished Baroque piece of music before pre Mozart. Why am I rambling on about this? Well, shut the fuck up and get to it, right?
A long time ago, in an episode far, far dumber than this one, I invoked the infamous dual process theory of cognition, an idea launched into mainstream awareness by Daniel Kahneman's pop-sci book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. Dual process theory's central claim is that human thought can be neatly divided into two modules, each evolved to handle different sorts of situations. System 1 is fast, instinctive, uncontrollable, unconscious, geared towards making efficient snap judgments in situations that demand immediate action. System 2 is slow, deliberate, controlled, conscious, good for negotiating difficult labyrinths of logic or multifaceted problems. If you have trouble remembering which is which, the fast one is impatient and wants to be first, so it's number one. Kahneman's book was a bestseller and became a go-to reference point in discourse about all sorts of subjects. The 2015 Institute of Medicine book, Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare, pressures doctors to use System 2 thinking to avoid errors of bias and stereotyping in their work, a recommendation echoed by the Journal of General Internal Medicine and a number of other medical publications. Baseball scouts and team managers regularly reference thinking fast and slow in their
I'm just reminded this morning there was an announced, the internet service provider was, taking down the network for an hour in order to whatever, maintenance or whatever, right? And so when I got connection, when I thought needed a connection, right? There was still no connection for me. And then I've sort of it was 1 hour after it supposedly needed to come back, right? So then I called. First of all, I went to the site that sort of there's a website I could see it on my mobile network phone, right? So I didn't have it's like you can't check whether or not the internet is down. If it's down, then you can't get to the internet, right? Begging the question here, right? One of those famous, we look for them, right? But it's like, okay, it's like I'm I'm brainstorming here, right? I'm thinking fast now. When people argue philosophically, they are disconnected usually from the meaning of the word in relation to your experience, right? But if I say to you, Well, my internet is down, so I went onto the internet to figure out what was wrong. You understand quite clearly, I hope, right? Then that is begging the question. It's a circular argument. Well, if the internet is down, right, you can't go and check the internet why it's down, right? Because you don't have that internet connection. So look for these, if you can put that sort of idea into when sort of somebody dissociated from reality, like Bernardo Castro, argues for whatever, this, that, or the other. Can you put it into a same kind of argumentation like I just did? Is it the internet? Well, now I'm going onto the internet to find out what is wrong with the internet that is down, right? So try to transpose it into something like that to see whether or not the argumentation structure is circular. And then it's valid. You can't have a circular argument because there's nothing in that reality that I am a part of in my everyday life that is circular, right? There is a particular structure, and that is sort of course, my mental interpretation, but they're never self-contradictory or self-refuting arguments like I'm going on the internet that is down, right? So, the point is that in relation to this here that Mr. THUNK is talking about, that what I did then was go on my phone and go on the app. There's an app connected to my internet service provider account, you could say, right? I went on that, tried to figure something out, and I checked whether or not there's some, bill that hadn't been paid or, whatever, something like that, right? No problems. Then there was a chat function on the app. Then I used that chat function, right? And I tried to get a connection, and then they wanted my account number. And then I had to go back into the app and find the account number. And then go back into the chat and then, write the account number. But then it didn't work. It's sort of the malfunctioning kind of chat. It didn't, when I pressed enter in the chat, nothing happened. It's just stayed frozen, right? I say, okay, I'll give them a phone call instead, right? So I called the, customer service of my ISP, internet service provider, and said, well, I have this problem. Okay, I will look into it. Yeah, and this, that, and the other. Yeah, it looks like there should be connection, but it seems like your modem, my router, is, I think it's called that nowadays, right? Modem is an old word, right? That there might be something with your router. Have you tried restarting it? I said, yes, I tried to restart it, and it's the same problem. These lights are on and these lights are not on. So, okay, it looks like it might need a resetting. I was like, oh no resetting. It's like, then it will erase the new passwords and go back to, default settings, and it's sort of, okay, if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. Now, I was calling this, he was sort of giving me a, this guy here you mentioned, diagnosing. He was diagnosing what was wrong, depending on my short description, right? So his approach apparently was, I need to fix it. I need to do something. I need to give him some medicine, metaphorically, which is reset your modem, right? Okay, so I went, stuck a pen in that little hole that you hold it for 10 seconds and then it resets, and then you have to wait half an hour for it, so you do whatever it does, right? And I had done that and said, okay, he said, well, call me back in half an hour if it still doesn't work, right? Okay, fair enough. Sit there and wait. And after 10 minutes, I get a new SMS from my ISP that in my area, things are still down, right? So, and I forgot to mention that, just for the sake of customer service and the lack of it, right? When I called on the phone, I had to wait 20 minutes to get in contact with them. Something like 15 minutes maybe, right? In something along those lines. There were 30 people in front of me in the queue. Okay, so then I got an SMS that things were down. And so I was sitting there with a reset modem and things were still down. So he was not correctly informed about things, right? about the circumstances, the context he was working in, as a customer service of the ISP who is responsible for taking the system down, right? And he told me to do something because he wanted to fix my problem, right? Rather than saying, I think that we might want, it can't possibly be us. So it must be your modem that is a problem. So you needn't have this quick fix medicine, right? So he's thinking quick without judging and trying to get a bigger picture of things, to get things into the right context, right? So at this point, after a couple of more hours, the whole thing came back. I'm sitting here talking to you, right? But I have a reset modem, right? I have to go back to the old password that is sort of printed on the modem, whatever, right? And I have to go back and change the setting on my phone and my computer, just because this dude wasn't well informed and needed to make a quick fix for me, right? It's sort of possibly the go-to. Well, we can always do something for the customer by telling them reset your modem, right? So it's just an example, right?
Discussions about acquiring talent. The theory has been invoked in works on military strategy, marketing, IT security, finance, user experience design, engineering safety, and artificial intelligence, among numerous others. As a general rule of thumb, a scientific theory that easily finds purchase in wildly unrelated fields should raise a red flag, just as if someone was trying to sell you a medicine that they claim is effective against cancer, arthritis, hair loss, and allergies. If you review all the clamoring for dual process theories about everything from baseball to AI, you'll find that the justification for invoking it mostly boils down to a pretty trivial observation. If you think hard about a decision and carefully weigh all the relevant information, you will often reach a different, better conclusion than if you just wing it. The System 1, System 2 framework is used as a sciencey sounding way to recommend that people deliberate a bit before committing to a course of action. Advice that most folks understand intuitively by the time they're 5.
Yeah, but it's also, an appeal to, it's sort of those who want you to not react on your instincts want to say you shouldn't react on your instincts. You should go and, think very carefully before you say something because it might be stupid, right? Now, I'm on the conviction that the slow process is based on the quick process, right? The quick process is your colors and your cognitions and your quick interpretations and so on. If they are not functional, why the hell would they be there, right? So I'm trusting that there's a good reason why they're there. I might not be able to get to the reason, but it's there, right? So it's sort of a rationalization about how my system works, right? And a good deal of what is going on when you're philosophizing is actually rationalizing, but at a later stage than after, when you have settled your metaphysics and your epistemology and maybe ethics, right? Now, I think rationalization is a part of ethics. That's my point of view. But, do your own thinking, right? But you have to have something to think long and hard about. That must be the quick and dirty experience, right? Now, there might be a series of quick and dirty experiences that eventually end up in a bigger picture than, as I referred to with this ISP problem I had, right? That he might say, okay, yeah, I have a very quick picture right now. I might like to make a bigger picture. Not that the little picture I have now is invalid just because I don't have the big picture yet. But I can't create a big picture by myself just trying to create that big picture, which is sort of in relation to what I've done recently with the deconstruction of Bernardo Castro. It seems that he has the quick and dirty dashboard, right? And then he creates this elaborate idea of mind at large that stretches from before the Big Bang and into the eternity of, the future, right? Now, that's a bit of a stretch between thinking fast and slow, right? And you can possibly knock yourself out becoming a little too slow, you could say, right? Where the quick thinking is where you get your impulses. And I think, personally, a way to see it is that the quick and dirty thinking is making sure that you are not being eaten by saber-toothed tigers, right? But the slow thinking is more like, how do I accommodate my life in relation to other people? You can't base that on, I have a feeling right now. But it has to be more planned out, right? You have to plan ahead and things like that, right? So I think that's, a way to see why we have this sort of combination of thinking. But what I really want to get to here, right? And I'm maybe, getting a little ahead of his presentation, maybe. But in order to get philosophical impulses, you can't do that by slow thinking. Because philosophy itself is taking quick thinking and making slow thinking out of it. So you need your quick thinking to get the impulses that creates the landscape of the slow thinking philosophy, right? And that's why I like to do this deconstruction, because I am letting myself be influenced by my quick thinking, right? My fast thinking, fast and slow, right? The fast thinking, where the impulse, when I get an impulse of something, I'm not saying, okay, I'm right about that impulse because I got the impulse, but at least I got the impulse that might point in a certain direction that I wouldn't have or get if I was staying in that slow thinking mode, where I need some impulses in order to get somewhere in that slow thinking. So my point of view and how it fits with my approach to commenting, criticizing, deconstructing, and so on other philosophers is by saying I'm letting my fast thinking inspire my slow thinking, right? Because otherwise you might end up in a situation where you are constantly slow thinking and you're just adapting somebody else's slow thinking and that becoming your philosophy. You have to have some quick thinking, the fast thinking, that influences your slow thinking so you can come up with your philosophy. You see my point? So, I have read parts of this fast and slow thinking, and I'm personally not too fond of these kinds of, there is this and there's that, these sort of dichotomy thinking, right? Generally, I don't want to influence my thinking too much working from these sort of popular kind of, sort of pseudo-philosophical whatever, right? I'm not ditching the book as such, as I'm just, I'm coming up with sort of, I'm relating to it here, right? But I would like to, it has to be fresh and coming from my own thinking, rather than, somebody came up with a dichotomy. I think I'm going to base my whole thinking, my whole life on this dichotomy that somebody came up with, right? Which was come up by using slow thinking to create a book, right? So, it might be circular even, right? So, just, it's not, the difficult part of philosophy is making sure you're not screwing around with how you think, right? You can't just violate various thinking structures that you actually need in order to get to some good conclusions about within your philosophy. So you're just getting to whatever you want and you're screwing around with your thinking structure, and then you're ending up with whatever you want anyway, right? So it's just wishful thinking rather than philosophy, right?
But hey, it's a pop-sized simplification of a well-respected scientific theory that laymen use as shorthand to express certain ideas. And it's not like telling people to think harder is a bad thing. So what's... Oh, wait, I forgot. It might be total bullshit. In 2018, cognitive science researchers Melnikoff and Barg laid into dual process theory in an opinion piece titled The Mythical Number 2, where they argue that the idea has nothing in the way of evidence, which turned out to be more true than they imagined, as we'll see in a bit. Worse yet, they assert that the theory's claims are incoherent and couldn't even be verified in principle. That's quite an accusation. But to be fair, suggesting that many features of human cognition can be neatly sorted under just two distinct categories is pretty audacious to begin with.
No, but it's sort of these slow thinking people then knock out something that is sort of a simplified way of approaching stuff, right? So is it then 3 or 4 or 5 categories instead, right? There is something to it, right? Because the way people, myself included, right? Maybe I should talk from my own stance as I claim that others should do, right? That I have a sense that I get some impulses that are quite quick, but at the same time, I'm sitting around thinking long and hard about various philosophical aspects, right? I mean, there is, at least there is something to it, right? It may be a graduation. They're not just the very quick and the very slow, right? There might be something in the middle. There is sort of halfway there, right? I don't know. But at least there are impulses that are usually attempted to be inhibited by people claiming to be a part of civilization, right? Which I don't know what is. I might have an idea, but right? They're saying you have to, you shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't be this. You shouldn't be that. Because they are sort of based more on emotional stuff rather than the long and hard thinking, right? And it's sort of you should be thinking about what you do rather than reacting instinctively, right? But there are certain situations where it's a very good idea to react instinctively, right? Like if you're in a car and somebody seems to be driving in the wrong side of the road, or you don't have fucking hours to think about it, right? Now might be an example where it's sort of given what to do, right? Avoid that car that is malfunctioning, right? But it's a spectrum where it all has to come together somehow, right? And no matter how elaborate you want your philosophy to be, you have to make some kind of shortcuts. You have to make some dichotomies. You have to make maybe some trichotomies, if that's what it's called, right? You have to simplify it and structure it and create a description somehow, right? And all the shortcomings of language and description when you try to present it to other people is not necessarily a way to criticize the philosophy because of the shortcomings of language, right? Because, metaphysics doesn't have its own language. People are using, myself included, right? Using physical language to describe a metaphysics that doesn't have a language. So, and in order to do that, you just have to come up with something that is a different language to describe something that doesn't have a language. So it's one way to do it might be, thinking fast and slow, right? So I'm fine with that. It can be inspirational to, get a grasp of something, get a picture of something, right? So,
like, if you say that unconscious stuff is system 1 and conscious stuff is system 2, so long as conscious and unconscious are cleanly separable, sure, no problem. But if you then go further to say that system 2 also encompasses intentional processes, you've essentially claimed that there's no such thing as an intentional, unconscious cognitive process, which is clearly untrue. Typing, driving a car, composing a sentence, these are all processes that happen without conscious deliberation about where to put your fingers.
Or maybe that consciousness just so short so it feels like it's not there, right? These kinds of how the mind does this, that, and the other is a rabbit hole of infinite dimensions, it seems, right? You can very quickly get so overwhelmed by this complexity that you might give up and say, I don't give it. I cannot possibly handle this, right? And then some people will come in and say, well, then you have to give some money to the academics They're trying to put electrodes on people and figure out what to do, right? No. You have, in my opinion, to come up with your own philosophy. Despite how complex it might be, then simplify it, right? Try to find some dichotomy then, just like, the thinking fast and slow. That might be a jumping off point, right? I mean, don't make it more complex than it needs to be, right? Start simple and then it might become slightly more complex and then you might find something that works, right? But starting out by saying it's so fucking complex and there are a gazillion books about this and somebody says this and somebody else says that, it's not really that. It's not really how you approach philosophy, in my opinion. This might not be exactly philosophy is doing here, but it smells of it at least a bit, right? So don't make it more complex than it has to. Go back to the basics, right? Find a functional reduction base, right? For instance, as I say, right, my 5 qualia is the reduction base, right? And I always have access to those 5 qualia. And I suppose, right, working from the axiom that when I experience an individual within my qualia, that individual axiomatically, according to my philosophy, can also have those colors, right? And when I point in a certain direction, I point to a color and say yellow, that other individual can also point and say yellow. Or they point and say yellow when I look in that direction without making any proposition or any statement about it. I can have experienced what I call yellow. It might not be the same qualia or even cognition we're referring to, but who cares if you can agree upon it, right? So at the end of the day, about this thinking is, right, at the end of the day, that your thinking is your problem, right? It's your problem. It's not somebody else's problem to come up with a categorization or classification or philosophy or anything like that about your thinking, right? Because your thinking is particular only to you in the sense that you can't get to other individuals' thinking no matter how hard you try, right? You can't experience other people's minds. So you can only experience your own colors, your own whatever, right? You only have your own experience. You don't even know if there are other individuals out there because it's all a part of your experience, right? So this is the deepest level of philosophy. And lo and behold, it actually gets frighteningly simple when you get down there, right? And that's also because it's so simple. If you take a wrong turn, right, it can very quickly get out of hand, right? If you take a wrong turn at the deepest level of this very, very simple structure of your experience, the wrong turn is extremely significant, right? So the further you get down the line, a wrong turn in your philosophy might not have the same significance, though it might have consequences, but it might be easier to go back and see, I can change it a bit here, right? The further back in your metaphysics, so to say, that the problem is, the harder it is to change it, because you are way more dedicated to whatever conclusion you came up with about these simple things, because the simplicity of it means that changing it fundamentally down there has enormous ramification for the rest of the philosophy, right? The rest of your philosophy might be fucking invalid, right? So the deeper the problem is, the more important it is that you're going in the right, direction, right? That you're not connecting the dots in a way with some super glue that you came up with, right? Okay.
How hard to break, or the rules of conjugation, but are nonetheless controlled by a person's intent. The same argument applies to solving math problems or puzzles unconsciously, or deliberately making decisions based on biased recall of evidence. There are numerous clear examples of psychological phenomena that express features from both systems.
And just, I'm sorry to interrupt him here, right? That if you're a good artist, is that as thinking fast or thinking slow? those who are, it's like, there's also, I read a book way back in the 80s, I think. There was a famous Danish football player called Michael Laudrup who played for Barcelona, right? And I think it was something about, or was it a national team play, something like that. And the first time he was on the field and he was alone he had a long time to run from down to the goalkeeper. And, he had to think about, okay, should I go to the left, go to the right? Should I, right? And then he went to the left and the goalkeeper went to the right. And he basically had a exposed goal and he should just kick it in, right? But then he kicked it in the side net. So it didn't become a goal, however you put it, right? So what he stated as the problem was he had too long to think about it. He had too long time to think about this, right? So he screwed up because he became sort of anxious or, whatever, right? So if he had just, got the ball took a step to the left and there was a free goal, he could just kick it in no problem, right? But here he had to run from the midfield all the way down to the goalkeeper. He had time to think about going to the left, going to the right. I have to kick it in the net, and then it's sort of the slow thinking there, or somewhat slower than fast thinking, right? Sort of inhibited his action because he was sort of overwhelmed maybe by the possibilities of doing this, doing that, and all the things that might go wrong, right? So sometimes quick thinking is preferable, fast thinking, right? So it's sort of, there's something to it, right? There is something to it. Now, this is just a story about a football player. I was not there, right? It's just what I've heard, right? I find it to be, reasonable. I've played football myself, and I sort of understand that, right? I was a goalkeeper when I played football as a young man, right? And if somebody just shot the ball, I just had to react and do what I could, right? But if there was somebody running from the midfield, I was sort of like, okay, what will he do? Will he do this? Will he do that? This could go wrong. That could go wrong. I had time to think about it, right? And then I was sort of, it could be almost paralyzing. All the kinds of things that could go wrong, if you get my drift, right? That I might, slightly paralyze myself because I have so long to think about it, it should be more safe that I would do the right thing. But if I'm just reacting out of a instinct, I could never be blamed for anything because I just did my best under the circumstances, so to say, right? So the slightly less fast thinking can be problematic, right? Because there's sort of a time frame. There's a time frame. It's not instant or it's not very fast, but it is slower than fast, but there's a very short time frame within which things has to have a resolution, right? You can think about if there's a car, 500 meters ahead, right? And you're driving, you don't have to react right now. That would be stupid because there's nothing to react to. But you know that you have to react before you reach that car, if that car doesn't do something in the meantime, right? So it's not the slightly less fast thinking that can be problematic, right? How would you get to slightly fast or slightly slower thinking using slow thinking? Well, you can't, right? Because slower thinking is based on that faster thinking somehow. It must be, right? They're not independent of each other. I think the slow thinking is based on fast thinking, right? Okay, so you can dig yourself into a rabbit hole here, possibly, right?
At the same time, this might explain why, although dual process theorists have established many examples of system one things happening together, they haven't produced any evidence that they don't normally appear with system two things, which is kind of necessary to get the theory off the ground. If the only prediction you can make about mental processes is They sometimes have these characteristics, except when they have other characteristics, or some combination of the two. You're not really saying anything. The failure of dual process theorists to produce evidence for a clean split between the two systems was exacerbated by the replication crisis, or even the original test results suggesting that these things tend to go together didn't materialize the way they had before. But the problems run deeper than a simple lack of evidence. Do you remember this bit? So long as conscious and unconscious are cleanly separable, sure, no problem. What we casually describe as being conscious of something has a bunch of moving parts, and psychology researchers have done a lot of work trying to differentiate different kinds of consciousness. There's the awareness of why you're doing something, like being conscious that you're upset because you haven't eaten. There's the awareness of what you're doing, like being conscious that you're being snippy when you respond to a friend's question. And then there's the awareness of the causal relationship between the two, like being conscious that you're being snippy because you're hangry. Any of these types of consciousness can occur without the others, which raises the question, if System 2 thinking is supposed to be conscious, what does it mean if a cognitive process satisfies one type of consciousness and not another? If I consciously weigh my options and carefully choose to buy a particular...
Now you are being very slow about something that might be slightly less slow and even fast, right? So it's sort of, I have to slow think about how you can divide something into fast think and slow think, right? Just be careful, it's not a circular argument, right?
particular thing, all while being unconsciously pushed toward one particular choice by advertising. Is that System 1 or System 2 at work? The other distinguishing factors of System 1 and 2, like speed, automaticity, and intentionality of a judgment, are also multifaceted.
Automaticity, I have to look that up.
And hard to resolve into yes-no binaries. And, speaking of binaries, Melnikoff and Barg note that psychologists, and humans generally, love to frame things as either-or dichotomies, even insanely complex things like human psychology. They cite a talk given in the early 70s by prolific AI and cognitive science research.
Yes, it's like, okay, it's a natural progression of your thinking, right? If you think about some kind of topic, let's just call it topic, you might find out there's variations within that topic. Maybe I can find that variation and say there are some that are mostly like this, and then there's some others that are mostly like that, right? The starting point is usually a dichotomy, right? But it's not necessarily right to stay in a dichotomy. Maybe it has to divert it into 3, 4, or 5 categories, or even some kind of gradation. But it's an attempt to describe something that's saying, okay, let me start with a dichotomy, right? Let's see if I can create a dichotomy. But maybe I shouldn't stay, is the slow thinking about it, right? That maybe I shouldn't stay in a dichotomy. Maybe I should see whether or not I can, because if the dividing line isn't that clear, maybe it's not because it's invalid thinking in general. It's just not clear-cut thinking. But it might still be useful to think that way, right? But it seems to me because there are some people who are very much slow thinking, right? And there are people who are sort of more like fast thinkers. I think I'm more in the fast thinking kind of group, right? I have something that I think of for years and years and years and years and years, right? I have slow thinking, but I cherish my fast thinking abilities also, because I think it's sort of it has to work together somehow, right? If you become slow thinking, you will never get to any of these direct experiences, qualia, and you know, enjoy the thrill of some fast thinking, right? That might inspire your slow thinking. If you're only slow thinking, you are staying in your abstractions, right? All these aspects he described here, these are abstractions. They're not something that has colors and sounds and so on, right? But in order to get to those abstractions, in the first place, you need to have some colors and sounds and taste and so on that created some cognitions from which you created some categories on abstractions or theories and whatever further down the line, right? And then you stay in these abstractions and create a lot of slow thinking but not realizing that you actually used some fast thinking in order to get to that slow thinking, right? So it's more complex than just there are these two groups, right? I think.
Alan Newell, lamenting the way that science tends to become trapped debating bitty binary questions that don't necessarily hide any special insight into the phenomena they're purportedly.
I'm just inspired to say that in the whole system of education is, in my opinion, you could see it as a way to destroy pupils, or whatever you want to call it, students' ability to be quick thinking and just accept slow thinking that usually somebody came up with. You're just learning how to do this slow thinking, whatever, right? So you're sort of you become a shut up and calculate kind of robot, rather than be a functional human being where there's a switch and a plethora of fast and slow thinking that has to come together in a whole that is you, right? So I think it's an interesting subject, this, because there's something about how you function as a thinking being that this taps into, but it's not necessarily clear cut into a dichotomy, right? As I try to get across.
Describing nature versus nurture, innate versus learned grammar, single versus dual memory. Even if we could find a silver bullet experiment to indisputably resolve these sorts of questions one way or the other, which doesn't happen a lot in psychology, it's not clear that we'd be any closer to understanding exactly how the human mind works. These are just questions we thought to ask, and we have no guarantee that they reflect any real distinctions in the universe. Newell describes this bitty, non-integrative approach as playing 20 questions with the universe, and he despairs that, as a strategy, it's probably not going to be sufficient to solve human psychology by the time he plans to retire in 1992. Good guess, Alan. Newell's anxieties about arbitrary and unilluminating scientific binaries fits the dual process theory to a T. Even if we could be irrefutably certain that the brain has these two distinct systems for cognition, it's not really clear what we might do with that information beyond what everyone seems to do with it already: warn people to think harder about important decisions. It's not the first time scientific-sounding terminology has been used to make a trivial point sound important, and it won't be the last. But considering how many issues dual process theory has as science, and how it plays right into this A or B tendency that plagues so much research, maybe we could stand to pick a different psychological paradigm for our think pieces and YouTube videos. Maybe one with, I don't know, 3 things. Is dual process theory's influence on public discourse oversized for its scientific merit? What scientific binaries do you imagine might be distorting the real shape of the world? Please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to blah blah, subscribe, blah, share, and don't stop thunking.
I won't. I had something I wanted to say now. It faded away. Yes. You can't think too slow, right? You be careful not to spend all of your life trying to get to a conclusion you will never get to. Because it seems like it's sort of, when it finalizes, it might be wrong. I might be incorrect, right? At some point you have to do it, right? If you want to jump from the, what's it called? 5 meter something, jump into the swimming pool, right? You can stand there and say, yeah, I would do this, do that, do that. At some point you have to fucking jump, right? And then say, okay, now it's now or never, right? And philosophy is also encumbered by just keep thinking slow and slow and slow and slow and slow and never getting anywhere, right? At some point you have to say, okay, it's good enough now, right? I have to try it on. I have to do something. I have to get out in the real world, so to say, right? And try it on for size. I can't stay in my armchair all my life and then not implementing whatever thinking, slow or maybe faster thinking I came up with, right? So if whatever you do as a philosopher doesn't materialize into some kind of adjustment of your actions or interactions, right? Then why bother, right? Why bother? There has to be some kind of time limit on sort of I have to do something at some point, right? And it seems to me a lot of people are staying in these cloud castles, creating all sorts of fancy, systems of metaphysics that never really materializes into any change in their everyday, right? So why the fuck bother with it, right? If it isn't connected somehow to how you live your life, then don't waste your time doing it, right? Now, if you have to do some slow thinking, there is a time span from you start thinking to you end that slow thinking and start to implement. So of course there is some time. You can't slow think very fast. Then it's sort of a contradiction, right? But it shouldn't be so slow that it's just you die slow thinking, right? So I'm just encouraging to, yes, I need to get somewhere with my philosophy, right? Okay. Have a nice day. See you in the next one.